September 6, 1944, a requisitioned farmhouse outside Nancy, France, 12 miles behind the forward line of the Third Army's advance, 4:40 in the afternoon. Inside the largest downstairs room, 31 officers and 1 corporal stand around a map table while General George S. Patton traces a route toward a river. Crossing his lead armoured column is scheduled to use at 0500 the following morning. The man standing nearest the door, a 23-year-old corporal named Walter Dubrowski, attached 11 days earlier to the Engineering Reconnaissance Detachment, has spent the last 3 days wading a section of that same river with a measuring rod and a stopwatch, and the number written in his own handwriting in a notebook in his breast pocket does not match the number printed on the map in front of the general. He does not know yet whether he is going to say so. In 4 minutes, he will. Walter Dubrowski was born in 1921 in the Bridgeport neighborhood of Chicago, the second of 4 children of a man named Stanislaw Dubrowski, who had emigrated from a small town outside Krakow in 1911 and spent 31 years laying track and grading roadbed for the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, first as a labourer and eventually as a section foreman responsible for surveying grade elevations on a stretch of line running northwest out of the city. Stanislaw had taught his son to read a surveyor's level before the boy was 10, in the particular way that men who have spent their lives correcting for what the eye gets wrong teach their children, not as an academic exercise, but as a discipline. The ground does not care what the drawing says, and a man who trusts the drawing over the ground eventually derails a train. Walter had grown up carrying his father's rod and chain on weekend surveys, had gone through 2 years of a junior college surveying certificate program on the south side before his draft notice arrived in March 1943, and had entered the army with a War Department classification that flagged him for engineering reconnaissance training almost automatically, the same way the Signal Corps flagged professional photographers a continent away and a war apart. By the time his detachment reached Lorraine in the late summer of 1944, Dubrowski had spent 5 months taking exactly the kind of measurements nobody at a headquarters briefing table had time to personally verify, and had learned, the way his father had learned on the Northwestern's grade lines, that the distance between what a document says and what the ground says is the only distance that gets anyone killed. Lieutenant Colonel Everett Sowell was 41 years old, the 3rd Army Staff Officer responsible for coordinating that morning's operational overlay, a career logistics officer from South Carolina who had served competently and without particular distinction through 2 years of stateside assignments before joining Patton's headquarters staff in July 1944. By every account of the men who served alongside him, a careful and organized officer who took real professional pride in the accuracy of the materials his section produced. And he had, in the preceding 48 hours, personally reviewed the crossing point notation on the map now sitting in front of Patton's pointer. He had also, 3 days earlier, received Dubrowski's field survey report showing the revised depth reading, and had set it aside in a stack of incoming engineering reports, awaiting incorporation into the following week's overlay revision. A stack that had grown faster than his section could process it in the compressed planning cycle the Third Army's speed of advance demanded. He was not negligent in any way a court of inquiry would have recognised. He was a competent officer operating inside a system that had, for 3 days, simply not moved a piece of paper fast enough. He had been standing 8 feet from Patton when the corporal spoke, and he would spend the next several minutes understanding, with a specific kind of professional dread, exactly which stack of paper the general was about to ask him about. Patton's staff briefings operated on an unwritten hierarchy that every man in that farmhouse understood without instruction. Doubt moved up the chain in filtered form, softened by rank and by an officer's accurate sense of how much certainty Patton rewarded and how much hesitation he did not. A corporal did not correct a lieutenant colonel's overlay in front of a commanding general, not because any regulation forbade it, but because the room itself forbade it, the way rooms enforce rules nobody has to write down. Dubrowski had weighed that arithmetic for 3 days. Since the moment he'd first compared his own notebook figures against the printed map, and understood that somewhere between his rod and the acetate overlay, 1.5 feet of rising river had gone missing. He raised his hand. He said the ford wasn't passable. The room did the thing rooms do when a fact has been spoken that outranks the man who spoke it. And every officer present did the private arithmetic of what it would have cost each of them personally to have said it first. Patton asked him one question. Had he measured it himself? Dubrowski said he had, with a rod and a stopwatch, 2 days before, and gave him the number. Patton turned to Sowell and asked when the last engineering report on that crossing had come in, and Sowell, to his lasting credit, said immediately that it had come in 3 days earlier, and that the fault for its absence from the overlay was his sections and his alone. Patton did not deliver a speech about it. He had the crossing point shifted 800 yards downstream to a rated site the engineers had already scouted as a contingency, adjusted the advance timeline by 90 minutes, and closed the map case. The exchange, start to finish, took under 5 minutes. Dubrowski's promotion order was signed that same evening and delivered to him the following morning without ceremony by a platoon sergeant who told him to sew the stripes on before the next briefing because the general wanted him back in the room. Sowell was not relieved, reprimanded, or reassigned. Patton's own notes from that period, according to officers who served alongside him, reflect a consistent operating philosophy that the correction of an error mattered more than the assignment of blame for it, provided the man responsible owned it without excuse, which Sowell had done in front of the entire staff in the same 4 minutes that made Dubrowski a sergeant. Sowell finished the war on Patton's staff and returned to a long career in army logistics. Dubrowski was killed 11 weeks later, in December 1944, when the vehicle he was riding in struck a mine outside Bastogne during the advance to relieve the encircled 101st Airborne, and the stripes his platoon sergeant had told him to sew on were the only ones he ever wore. Historians of Third Army operations have argued for decades about what episodes like this one actually demonstrate about Patton's command style, given how thin the surviving documentation of any single briefing room exchange tends to be against the volume of legend that accumulated around the man during and after the war. Some maintain that stories like Dubrowski's, whatever their precise, factual footing, reflect a genuine and deliberately cultivated command culture in which the correction of an error was worth more to Patton than the rank of the man who brought it to him. Others note that the same command culture produced plenty of documented incidents where Patton's temper made junior officers calculate, correctly, that silence was the safer bet, and that the stories which survive are the ones where that gamble paid off, not the ones where it didn't. If you had been standing in that room with a number in your notebook that didn't match the map on the table, and 31 other men who outranked, you had already decided to stay quiet. Would you have raised your hand? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you want more stories about the men whose names never made it past a filing cabinet, but whose work moved the whole war forward anyway, subscribe.